Good afternoon again, everyone, and welcome to our first Planning Live with a studio audience. My name is Fiona Bruce, I am Karen Hamilton. I'm a partner in the planning team here at Brodie's. Now, we started Planning Live back in June 2020 and have been delighted that so many people have been able to join us every month for our discussions on various planning topics. I think when we started the series, we had no idea that we'd still be going strong 5 years later. So this is in fact the 50th session, which we wanted to mark the occasion, not just by having another fantastic guest, but also by inviting you, our audience, or as many of you as could possibly fit into this room to join us and listen in person and stay for a refreshment afterwards. So in addition to those in the room, we have about 100 people joining us online today in the usual way. So welcome to everyone online. I'm afraid that you'll have to make your own arrangements for refreshments at the end of the session, which I encourage you to do as Thursday after all. So during the time that we've hosted Planning Live, we've had lots of fantastic guests discussing a wide range of topical planning matters, and we're delighted that so many of our former guests have also been able to join us this afternoon, so a special welcome to all of you. Since we started Planning Live, there have been no fewer than 4 planning ministers in Scottish Government. So Kevin Stewart and Tom Arthur both joined us when in office. I'm afraid that Joe Fitzpatrick slipped through our net, sadly, but we're delighted to be joined today by Ivan McKee, the current Minister for Public Finance, in whose portfolio planning currently sits. So as many of you will know, prior to being elected as an MSP in 2016, Ivan held a number of senior roles in manufacturing and business, managing companies in the UK and abroad. So prior to his current ministerial position, Ivan has been Minister for Trade, Investment and Innovation and Minister for Business, Trade, Tourism and Enterprise. So he absolutely understands the importance of planning to the economy. So Minister, thank you very much for making time in your diary to join us today on Planning Live. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleagues, Neil and Elaine, who I think need no introduction, who would like to kick off the chat for today.
Thanks, Karen, and thank you everybody for coming. It's just I'm going to make sure I can stay on the seat. That'll be a major achievement, I think. Minister, here's one I made earlier.
Thank you.
I'm going to take you back first of all to before you became minister, and actually it's probably in Kevin Stewart's reign, if you like, with the Planning Scotland Act 2019 and the reforms that were aimed at strengthening the contribution that planning can make to the economy, as Karen said, and delivering more housing, having inclusive growth, empowering communities. So that's the kind of context. And then, of course, we had National Planning Framework 4, which came in to force in February 2023. So it's just had its second birthday. And be fair to say, probably like most babies, there's been some teething problems, perhaps. But we thought we might have a little look at, where NPF4 is and some of the policies in NPF4 and what we might be able to expect kind of in the coming session in 2025. And I know back in September, you and the Chief Planner outlined some of the priorities, and we had an updated letter, obviously, just in January. So starting perhaps, kind of near the front of NPF4 and Policy 2 on climate change and mitigation, we were expecting some guidance, on that and how that should be applied. And it was just to see whether that's likely to be coming out soon. Is there something that we can expect to see?
Yeah, I mean, well, in general, NPF4 is obviously been a significant piece of work off the back of the Planning Act from 2019, and I think it's a different approach to how we worked through the various different policies, and clearly, as time evolves, there's some of those policies that come to the fore that previously might not have been same consideration. So making sure that all of that's pulled together in that document. And one of the points we make very strongly is that it's not a hierarchy. The whole document, the whole system needs to be considered in the round when planning decisions are being made. But specifically on the policy 2 you're talking about, it's an expert working group been working on that. I think we published some stuff last year from some initial findings, and we would intend to have some guidance out on that in the spring. So that's where we're going on that. And as we talk through different policies, that's a bit of a pattern. We're working through and clarifying guidance to make sure that that there is, as issues come to the fore that need to be addressed, it's helping us kind of fine tune and focus and provide that additional guidance. It helps planners and others across the sector to understand better what the policies are, how best to implement and understand them.
And sticking with the MPF4 theme, but turning now to biodiversity, which is policy 3. I must have.
We're going to work through every one.
No,
and personally, I always find it difficult when people refer to the policies by number. I'm sort of, which one's that again? So it's biodiversity.
Yep,
and as we know, it was one of the changes, as it were, introducing the push towards biodiversity enhancement, and quite interesting for those of us keeping an eye on what's happening in England and Wales, because pushing to the same objective, but a different way to do it. And in part, that actually comes through this question, which is from one of our previous guests, Caroline McPartland, who I was speaking to earlier. Thank you, Caroline, for being on before, but also for contributing the question. The policy is the drive to biodiversity enhancement. As things stand at the moment, there is the policy sitting in isolation with that objective. The government is developing a metric to provide a framework for actually implementing that policy and getting that enhancement. Can you give us an update on progress with the metric, when it might be published, and has there been any feedback about whether the lack of the metric has held things back, or indeed actually has the lack of that sort of framework maybe helped because it's just given everyone a degree of flexibility to get the best outcome?
Yeah, it's a good question. You're right. There's that commitment and intention to have that metric in place, and Nature Scot are taking that work forward and are working through that at the moment. So I think they'll be bringing out some more guidance on that and an update on where they are shortly and working through. And I think we'll be through by another few months before we're in a position to publish a metric as such. But I think that if you look at the policy itself, it talks about application of best practice in terms of the assessments on biodiversity, and it works equally well, I think, in terms of a qualitative assessment as well as a quantitative one. So I think the metric will help, and I think even the process of going through and developing the metric helps to clarify a lot of what the expectations are. But I think in the absence of the metric, the policy, I think, is absolutely fine to be used as it is. In terms of does that offer more flexibility and a little bit more constraint with the metrics in place, I would like to think it will still have that ability to reflect the wider considerations, but I think the metric will just give a bit more information and maybe a bit more focus on what the important factors are around about that biodiversity.
Well, something for us to look forward to then. Jumping a few policies, you'll be glad, because otherwise we were going to be here till midnight. Policy 11 on energy, and that's another one that's attracted a lot of attention, major policy shift. Scottish Government were going to be holding a roundtable discussion with heads of planning and the renewable sector to collaborate on the application of Policy 11C and the role of local and community socio-economic benefits. I wrote that down because it's quite hard to remember. has that meeting taken place? Can you give us an update on what's happening? Because I'm certainly aware from the work I do that that topic of socioeconomic benefits, the maximising that's mentioned in 11C, is attracting a lot of attention and interest.
Yeah, I mean, officials have met, had a roundtable discussion with the sector, so that's happened towards the end of last year, and I mean, we remain clear that the community benefits, of course, are voluntary arrangements, but we're clear that it's to be encouraged and it's part of the process. So we wrote out to myself and the chief planner wrote out to stakeholders and reinforced that point that it's voluntary arrangements, and 11C doesn't effectively change that in practice. And then in December, we published a consultation on the good practice principles around about taking those community benefits forward. We've got that consultation ongoing, and it closes on the 11th of April. So anybody's got an interest should participate in that process as we continue to develop the work on that policy.
I'm going to jump you forward again.
Yeah.
And it's policy 22 on flooding, and that's one that many people would probably see as restricts developments. You know, we've got sites that have been allocated, for example, for housing, and then on the basis that they've got to be assessed against, you know, the 1 in 200 plus climate change, you're finding that that's obviously impacting on the land that's been available for development. And again, I know you've had personal experience of you know, dealing with the policy for called-in applications. Can we expect guidance? We keep getting the suggestion that there's going to be guidance on how it's got to be applied. Is that something that we're going to see coming forward this year?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. 22 is one that I do know.
Yeah.
You say the number, I'm like, I know what's coming next. It's right from taking up the position in the middle of last year. It's been something that's been to the fore, and I'm very conscious of the issues, the challenges that it can cause. I've had meetings with SEPA to dig into the practice that they are using, understand the methodology and the numbers that they're using on their once in a 200-year event, or however you want to define it, and the maps and data that they're using there. I think it's hugely important that we understand, because this is a risk-based assessment at the end of the day, and if you've got, depending on what the application is for, the type of use it's for, where it is, what the impact of a flooding event would be in terms of risk to the premises or risk to life and limb, etc. So all that's got to be considered in the round, and I've been, as I say, quite conscious of the fact that this needs to be a balanced consideration in terms of the advice that SEPA's given. And you're right, there's been a number of those applications that have gone through a ministerial process where I've taken a view on what SEPA said and what other information there may be, and had a look at what the applications look like and come to what I consider a balanced perspective on that. We're doing some work, I think, just at the moment, just to kind of help clarify and issue some more guidance on what that looks like, just to help everybody understand what that where we're trying to get to and how they should apply that policy. I'm hopeful that as we go through that, there'll be more of a coalescing round about what is acceptable and what isn't, so that local authorities, planning authorities, SEPA, government and applicants sort of kind of get a better understanding, more of a common understanding as we work through individual examples and clarify whether they should go ahead or not. So yeah,
it's more, as you say, it's about looking at them and balancing the risk and site specific. I think the feeling was we had a specific session on flooding, a planning live session discussing with Kaya, and it was about the fact that some of the risk is so far down the road, but the way the policy kind of is drafted, we never quite get over the policy hurdle and look at the solution. So it's good in terms of what you're saying is actually, I'm looking at it and I look at it, and hopefully that's the way the planning authorities.
I think so, and I'm hopeful that as I say, we work through specific examples and determinations are made one way or the other through the parts of the process, including, as I say, by a ministerial decision, then we can help to people can hone in on where the line is and about what works and what doesn't. Yeah, and it gets quite technical. It's just once in a 200-year thing, but it's really a 0.5% in any given year. And you run the numbers on that, isn't exactly once in 200 years. And of course, it depends on when it is and what it is, and the length of the bill's expected to be up. You can be in a position where it's
Is it ever really going to happen?
Well, that's right. And it's, I thought a very funny example, and I won't tell you what it was or where it was or who it was, but somebody said to me, it's ridiculous, once in this 200-year thing. This village where you're planning to put this hasn't flooded since 1827 or something. And I said, you're just about due another one. It's a 200-year event. I said, oh, okay. So, yeah, it's, you're right. Some of it, depending on what the proposal is and the nature of the development, that needs to be considered in the round.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to be honest, frankly, in a lot of cases, there'll be conditions that can be put in place that can allow it to move forward by mitigation. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to take you to one of my favourite topics, which is housing. I'm not going to ask you about Policy 16, but more housing and kind of general. And obviously, we've had the Housing Emergency Delivery Plan published, and obviously this is a focus about how planning can help. And one of the things that's been suggested, obviously, is the planning hub and how that will help to, deliver more housing. How do you envisage the hub is going to be used to help both planning authorities and developers? So,
I mean, well, first of all, in terms of housing, I mean, we're absolutely hugely conscious of the fact that there is a housing emergency. We are conscious of the fact that planning may not have caused the housing emergency, and we can talk more on that later, perhaps. It's absolutely a big part of the solution. So we need to be focused on making sure that that is the focus we've got. Of course, balancing all the other policies in NPF4. In terms of the hub specifically, I mean, the genesis of this, it's an idea that's been kicking about for a while, as in why don't we help by centralising some resource, providing a bit more oomph and bandwidth, particularly to planning authorities that may not very often have need to access specific resource. And it was one of these things that actually wasn't really going anywhere. And then what happened was myself and Gillian Martin grabbed some funding that was going to be put out to local authorities on a kind of bid-in basis for hydrogen. And we said, look, let's just keep this and set up the hydrogen hub. So we did that, and then off the back of that, very quickly, the housing stakeholders rightly came and said, well, can we have one as well? So we reconfigured some of the work that was going on to provide that. It's got funding through the initial period as we develop it, and we repurposed a lot of resource that was there anyway. But the whole concept, in short, is that local authorities are stretched in terms of the resource that they can apply to planning applications, and I think we'll come on and talk about that in a bit more detail as well. So what can we at the centre do to be more active in terms of how we support that? And there'll be specific expertise, and flooding's an example, and there'll be other areas where you wouldn't necessarily have all that expertise in every planning authority all the time. And it's where we can help to provide that expertise on a case-by-case basis. But the initial work that we're working through is on the stalled sites. So it's to understand where we've got sites that aren't moving for specific reasons, and there's a whole plethora of reasons why they can be stuck, and then to engage a team from government that can help to apply resource, understand the blockages, bring in partners that may be part of the solution, and help to move things forward, and just give it that bit more focus. There's a careful line here between obviously government not been part of the decision-making process, because that rightly lies, and it's obviously a very structured process with the planning authority, but where that resource, and I say particularly that dedicated resource, can be applied on specific sites to unlock stalled sites, then that is something that we're doing. And I think that model will develop over time as we figure out the best way to apply it. And we're now doing it on hydrogen, which the Improvement Service have been working on with us for a few months, on the housing hub, and also on offshore and onshore wind as well. So in all of those areas, we're kind of getting rolling out.
So it's building up that knowledge bank, so that you can then deliver it out to the different sites, different local authorities, and have them coming through.
Exactly. And the hydrogen one's interesting because we're looking at that as being a very early stage technology, but we want to get ahead of the curve on that because clearly in other parts of the energy sector, we've kind of got ourselves into a place where the number of applications starts to ramp up and everybody's kind of getting stressed about how they deal with them and what the right way to approach it is, etc. So with hydrogen, we're trying to get ahead of the curve so we can get the expertise and a lot of the way we approach these things in place earlier.
So you mentioned there the stalled sites, and I think my recollection is there was a suggestion there were 164,000 homes that had been consented, but that weren't coming forward. And I know dealing with stalled sites, and you mentioned that the planning hub would be kind of used. Has that number been refined, or do we have a better idea? And are there other measures that are being taken to encourage those sites to be delivered into the pipeline?
Super question. It's one of the first questions I asked was, and it was actually triggered. I think somebody said something at a committee about there's a lot of stuff getting planning permission but not getting built out. So I asked officials to go and dig up the numbers. So what we've done is we've just basically trawled planning authorities to find out how many sites are sitting with planning permission that haven't been completed yet. Right. The 164,000 number doesn't actually include all planning authorities because we're still collecting data, so the number will be higher than that. But there's everything in there from stuff that's been sitting for decades, in some cases just getting renewed every few years, but nobody's getting any intention of doing anything with it for whatever reason, right through stuff that's in process and nearing completion. So we've now got a kind of breakdown of where things are at various stages in that pipeline. The work on installed sites is the stuff that's clearly further down that pipeline, and there's 20,000 units that the team's been working on. And when you distill that down, there's 11,000 that are start for various reasons, and another 3,000 that are part of the affordable housing supply, and there's finance issues that are holding them up that should be cleared now with the extra funding that's going into that programme. So altogether there's about 14,000 that they've actually got a handle on what's wrong with them and what we need to do to move those forward. So they're working on that, but we had a great meeting with Homes for Scotland yesterday, and we've got a common approach to how we dig into what else is sitting there. Because everybody's kind of looking at it saying, well, it's not me, it's somebody else, right? But clearly everybody's got a slice of it. And where the data will help us understand where the issues are and then what the solutions are. It might lead to some changes in the way we approach this in terms of tidying up stuff that frankly shouldn't be. It should be recognise it's never going to get built out for various reasons, and that's fine. But what it has done is it's shone a big light, and it's got everybody running about trying to figure out what the answer to the exam question is, which is really helpful.
Yes, yeah.
It's flushing out a lot of information and data and process stuff that's in there. So we'll see how that goes, but I'm hopeful that that's helped to change the debate. The other interesting statistic is that, and this was in the CMA report, and it ties with our data. Over the last few years, we've been on average giving planning permission for 29,000 units a year, which obviously is far in excess of the 20-ish thousand that's been built out, slightly less than that. So every year we're adding more units to that 160,000 pile. There's a couple of questions I've got in there, which is, well, if we're spending a third of the resource on taking units through the planning process that aren't then getting built out, not only are we not building out the units, we're also chewing up a third of the capacity in the planning system that is constrained working on stuff that isn't getting built out. So we need to kind of understand that a wee bit better, and maybe there's a need to kind of focus a bit better on what we're actually taking through the system.
And I suppose even rewinding, before the permission stage, obviously with the LDPs and the review, the encouragement is, if sites aren't coming or haven't come forward, don't keep rolling them forward. You can look at, deallocating them. So again, the sites that are coming through in the LDP have to be deliverable.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. That process, and it's obviously a process that's taken a wee while. So the first few have come through with the evidence, and some of those are moving forward. Some we've sent back, frankly, because there needs to be more evidence there. That's how the process should be. But you're right, as that gets worked through in detail, that should flush out the sites that can be taken forward and the stuff that can't, so that we've got a robust pipeline of projects there, of deliverable sites, and the audits on the land supply will help that, because that's given a bit more clarity as to what should be counted in those numbers, which is important, because there was obviously variation previously on how that was done locally. So trying to give a bit more clarity on how that should be calculated.
I'm all about beds, so I've got another question about beds,
Okay.
which is other forms of housing. Obviously, we talk generally, about housing, but what about, the build to rent, co-living? What role do you see that playing in helping to meet the housing emergency?
Well, I mean, it's all part of the solution. I think clearly government's got a big focus on affordable housing, because that's where we put significant investment in, and that obviously helps with the poverty agenda we're addressing, and the quality agenda. But I recognise that all tenure is really important, because the more units you've got getting put in at any part of the profile of the housing profile, it's going to help the overall picture. Because if there isn't something in mid-market, or there isn't something in BTR, or there isn't something in the student site, then all that does is pushes people
More
in other
pressure.
parts of the sector and puts other pressure on there. So that, frankly, my attitude is the more units you've got in whatever part of the supply, it's going to help the overall picture. So yeah, BTR is very important, as is the student build, frankly, and that's not always popular in some locations, but I think it's definitely part of the answer. I think the work, and it's obviously my colleague Paul McLennan, the Housing Minister, that's taking this forward. But I think we're in a much better place now in terms of clarity around about the housing bill and how that's going to play in, and that helping to stimulate investment into BTR and elsewhere is a really important part of the picture.
I'm going to give you a break from housing.
Master plan consent areas, as anyone who follows our blogs will know, bit of a pet topic of mine. It does tie back into the housing, because that's one of the uses that's been suggested. But the exciting thing, particularly reading the guidance which just came out from Scottish Government, it is the vast range of potential uses. So it's a wonderful flexible tool in that sense. Scottish Government has indicated support for early adopters, and it's a local authority power, so it's the local authorities. Can you give us any insights into locations or areas or councils, or indeed landowners, developers who have expressed interest, and some of the things we might be seeing now that the powers are actually live? They went live in December, so we're a couple of months in now.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. We're encouraging local authorities and others with an interest to come forward with that, and a really good conversation. Myself and the First Minister actually met with Homes for Scotland yesterday, and this is one of the things they raised about how they can work with us to help to stimulate and move that forward, because it was obviously all part of the plan-led approach, and that is, I think, a very effective tool that planning authorities can latch on to and use to accelerate project-specific areas. I'm going to visit Stirling in the next few weeks. They're taking forward some proposals. I think there's some stuff down in Ayrshire. One of the obvious ones is up in Cromarty with the Greenport, which is going to bring in a lot of industrial development, but the housing needs that go with that are going to be significant. So surrounding the Greenport, there's going to be, I think, a real focus on taking forward an MCA, and I would encourage others that are looking at this to come forward and have the conversation, so as we can understand how best to apply that to get a bit more a bit more oomph behind some of those needed developments in certain specific locations.
Although the master plan consent areas are led by the local authorities, are you expecting that it's going to be the developers that pay for putting all the work that needs to go into it, the environmental impact assessment?
I think that'll be worked together. Yeah, aye. So it's and that kind of helps with the cooperative approach to this, because clearly the council could be looking at that saying, hold on a minute, we've got a lot up front here in terms of the investment. So I think having the council working with the developers at that early stage is in everybody's interest, and it's absolutely what we'd encourage, including how that's funded going through the process. Yeah.
was making me think of compulsory purchase and the kind of back-to-back where obviously local authorities will often use their compulsory purchase powers for the developers' regeneration to help that. And we've been involved, particularly Cadden, in a number of the kind of schemes, compulsory purchase schemes for roads and infrastructure. I sit with Tom on the advisory group for the compulsory purchase reform. Do you think that local authorities should be using their powers more? And are you able to update the audience in terms of where we are on the reforms?
Yeah, I mean, we've got the expert group working on this with Rosanna Cunningham and Chief Planner sits on that. Yeah, and yourself and others. So it's that work's been ongoing, and I think we're expecting. I'm going to meet with Rosanna quite soon to talk through where they're up to on that. But I think we'll expect to see some work coming out of that group fairly shortly, with potential to doing some. Will be after the election before I think we get to legislative changes. So I'm not a lawyer, but I understand that the legal part of this is quite clunky and quite dated.
1845.
Well, there you go. Yeah, aye. So there's it's due an update. So I think that there's quite a thorough bit of work been done there. The proposals coming forward from that should put us in a much better place to enable councils to take forward CPOs where it makes sense and it's appropriate. I know that some councils already do it.
Yes.
And obviously I'm close to Glasgow and I know they kind of use it, but I think they and everybody would welcome an update in the legislation and making the whole process less clunky and more friendly for them to take forward and use it where it's appropriate.
Yeah, if we can make it easier, both from the local authorities or the acquiring authorities' point of view, and then also easier to understand for the landowners. Whose land is obviously taken from them for public interest. But I would commend the team that is leading, and Tom, and that in terms of the level of detail that they're going into. It's just it's on the money. It's very detailed. So, and I would encourage everybody to get involved in the public consultation that will happen, kind of later. There's a lot of work, being put into it to get it to that. So,
and on the subject of law reform, but harking back to the Planning Act, I almost called it the Planning Bill because we get so used to calling it the Planning Act. There was a few things that we suggested catching up on. What I'm going to do is I'm going to jump to regional spatial strategies, because when I saw it on the list, I thought, gosh, yes, not heard anything about regional spatial strategies for a while. So what is happening? What can we be looking forward to?
So what I would say is I think that everything that's in the Act, we're intending to take forward. It's a question of prioritise what's going to have the biggest impact quickest. So MCAs we've talked about, we've got a big focus on resourcing. Obviously, we've talked about the various policies in NPF4, 22 and others that we're working through. Clearly, a lot of stuff around about policy 16. So I think it's a question of us just being focused on what's going to have the biggest impact, but everything that's on that list, we'll kind of get to it as we work our way through that, because it's important to keep the resource that we have got in government focused on, keeping the day-to-day running, but in terms of the areas they're focused on, they can only do so much at a time as we work our way through that. And I think that they're focused on the most important stuff at the moment. But as I say, everything else that's there, we'll get to it.
One of the things you're not going to get to, which I think many people in the room are quite happy about, is the infrastructure levy. Yes. Obviously, you indicated, in November that wasn't going to progress, but you did indicate that you're looking at guidance on Section 75 agreements. What's that likely to look like?
Well, it's before my time, obviously, the genesis of the infrastructure levy, but I think that was looking for something that would obviously put more money into that infrastructure investment, again, lined up with infrastructure first approach to development, but recognising that Section 75 might not be doing everything it needed to do in that space. So I think to kind of simplify that, not taking forward the infrastructure levy, as you say, gives people a bit of comfort that that's not on the radar now. But alongside that, having a look at Section 75 to understand if there's anything in there that we should be looking at, if that's been applied in a way that delivers what we wanted to deliver. And frankly, when we looked at the numbers on this, the amount that the infrastructure levy was going to raise was small fraction of what's already getting raised through Section 75. So it kind of made more sense to say, right, what are we trying to achieve here? Let's look at 75 and understand if there's anything in there that gets us to the same place without having to go down the road of a new levy. I have to say that not everybody is delighted about that. And some parliamentary colleagues were making points quite strongly in the chamber when we did the budget debate on taxation this afternoon, arguing for or arguing against the fact that we've let the sunset clause expire on the infrastructure levy. But yeah, I'm engaging with parliamentary colleagues on that as well. So we're taking ideas from all over the place in terms of what is Section 75 doing and does it need to be looked at.
It feels as though it works. You know, we've got a kind of fairly established templates, you know, with generally the councils. And I know there's been some work on standardising that so that we all use but the problem is you can have a standard clause and then you have to shape it. That's where the lawyers come in. So you can't get rid of lawyers. You're still going to need them to come in and make it, you know, kind of relate specifically to the development. I'm probably asked all my questions, or I could go back to housing if you want me to.
I like the way that you finished up with a plug for the lawyers just
Yes.
at the end of your questions. Well done, Elaine. So I think maybe it's a good time to open things to the floor if people have been sitting thinking about things that they, questions that they might like to put to the Minister. But perhaps I'll kick us off with, I think, a question that Amy from the Brodies team had.
Do you think that MPF4 is strong enough to assist with the regeneration of town centres? Do you think it goes far enough?
Well, certainly it's got that presumption in favour of brownfield and rather than greenfield, which I think is important. There are, and that's a complex problem in town centre regeneration. It isn't just a planning issue. I mean, there's a whole series of trends in terms of home delivery and move away from bricks and mortar retail and different purposes for town centres, etc. And I think that the solution in many regards lies in more housing and town centre developments. And I think planning authorities, by and large, certainly cities, kind of get that and are moving very much in that direction. So I think it takes us in the right direction. But again, if there's any specifics there, obviously interested to discuss that in more detail. One of the things around about permitted development rights that we're kind of looking at is above shops development and into housing, that kind of thing. So those kind of use cases, whether that's a specific examples of things that we can look to make a wee bit easier. But as I say, I think it's a multifaceted challenge, town centres, and how we drive that regeneration. But if there's other things we can be looking at there, I know myself and ministerial colleagues that lead on that, I'd be interested to look at that.
I sit on the Aberdeen Inspired, which is the bid company for the city centre, and we have upper floors empty properties. It's quite difficult because you find that many of the properties no longer have an access to the upper floors because the way they've yes, yeah. Or my bête noire is, where do the bins go? Because everybody's now got bins, which wasn't, where's the back? So it is really quite hard. We talk about bringing back housing and people into the city centre, but actually practically it's quite, and then you have what about the health centres and what about the kind of schools? But yeah, repurposing. See, we've just got plans. Obviously the John Lewis, we no longer have a John Lewis in Aberdeen, but it's going to be a go-kart. That's right, enter it, and you're going to be able to go from floor to floor. Thinking this sounds fab. Should have more of those. And then it comes back to planning authorities using their compulsory purchase powers. The more I read about reports and solutions, we've got the powers in place. It's just encouraging people to use them more. And if you can't redevelop it because there's no access, knock the building down and start again.
It's funny that you mentioned that, Elaine, just in terms of not having access to upper floors and things of that nature. One of the CPOs we dealt with recently, that was part of what it was having to do, sort of reopen pens that had been closed over time and reopen accesses from main streets in the town centre, etc., to give that connectivity. So playing quite a wide role there. So I'm going to look out to the room now. Lots of Happy faces. Yes, can I go with Stefano first, please? Would you like to give?
Yeah, there's no microphone.
But
I shall come up with my mic.
Not that I need a microphone. Great, thanks very much, Karen. It's Stefano Smith. I'm Planning Director at Third Revolution Projects. Thank you very much, Minister, for some really interesting responses to some tough questioning there by Neil and Elaine. My question relates to the issue of energy infrastructure and renewables and the relationship of that with strategic developments and how that may influence spatial planning. We feel that there's an exponential change happening in terms of where development is to be located spatially. It's not simply, for example, plugging into the national grid now. It's about its relationship with renewables and the opportunity for decarbonisation. So solar, battery storage, etc., and its relationship to strategic housing, for example, and its influence on energy strategies. Do you think NPF4 supports that with its climate change and energy policies?
I think it does because it brings everything under that one roof, if you like, in terms of all the policies are there and they all need to be considered as part of the proposal that's been taken forward. I suppose the policies are there as in they're looked at through the lens of here's an application, how does it fit with the policies? I suppose what you're hitting at is going to kind of should that be flipped? And you're saying when you design the development, you design it with all those policies in mind, with energy at the heart of it. And I think you're right that that whole landscape is evolving because we've come from or we are still in an environment where the grid is the kind of king, right? And everything kind of hangs off the grid. But over time, that's going to evolve into more local generation, local usage, off-grid, private wire, etc., for all kinds of uses, be it industrial or be it other housing development and so on. And I suppose at the moment what we've got is big grid infrastructure investment, we've got big energy generation onshore and offshore, we've got big battery storage applications all over the place. Hydrogen potentially coming down the line, so there's a lot of that big infrastructure on the energy side. Now, clearly at a micro level, you've got requirements on heat pumps, on solar, etc., in terms of new developments, which is kind of helping to take some of the edge off that. You've got really interesting developments like Queen's Quay out in Clydebank that I visited, which is super. You've got the heat pumps in the river that are driving the energy supply for that development and the surrounding area. There's clearly pricing issues in the energy market that kind of mitigate against that. The way price of electricity is tied to the price of gas, etc., kind of keeps the price of electricity higher than it need to be for those kind of developments. So I think moving on that would unlock a lot of development in the kind of space you're talking about. Star Refrigeration, who supply those heat pumps, they'll tell you, I can't remember exactly the statistic, but 80% of the population in Scotland lives within 1 or 2 miles of a waterway, right, a river, a canal, or the sea, right? So the potential for that kind of development is enormous. So I think you're right, it's hugely important, and we're probably only at the beginning stages of figuring out how that sits in terms of housing and other development going forward.
Can I maybe pick up though? Elaine was saying we still need the lawyers. And listening to your question and the answer was reminding me we need the planners. Let's pick up the planners as well. Because the interesting thing with NPF4 and the reaction it's had is I think there's a basic human need sometimes to be told what to do. So quite often when new policy comes out, we're looking for it to be more prescriptive than it actually is. But I think in many ways, that's not the purpose of policy. The purpose of policy is that enabling. And it's a bit like, as we were talking about with master plan consent areas, the flexibility of here's the tool. You can use it for lots of different things. So for me, that's a lot of the purpose of NPF4 is that enabling, here's a framework. it's not maybe as prescriptive as some of us might like, but actually that's kind of the point, because as you're saying, we don't know what the future is going to be like, particularly with that electricity piece. So we don't want things to be too prescriptive, because if they're too prescriptive, it will stall things. So as the minister is saying, the great thing about MPF4 is just that basic support, particularly for renewables. And it's the opportunity for planners to grasp and say, well, what are the settlements of the future, the industrial areas of the future going to look like? Where are they going to be? But most particularly, as you're saying, what infrastructure are they going to need? The one thing we know is it's not going to be infrastructure as we know it at the moment. We can probably say that whatever the infrastructure in 10 years' time is going to be, it's not what we think it's going to be at the moment, because that's the pattern that it's been. So we need the flexibility. And that's the opportunity or the challenge, depending on how you look at it, for the planners, of looking ahead, having a bit of vision, having that flexibility as well. And that's quite exciting.
And being ambitious.
And being ambitious.
What MPF4 is designed to be ambitious.
All discussions come back to infrastructure at some point or another. So do we have next question?
Stuart Hay from the Royal Corporation of Architects in Scotland. Architects actually love planners because they drive up design standards, but what they don't love is not being able to speak to them and collaborate. And the question is about fees and what you get for fees, and particularly pre-application advice, whether the government will be more prescriptive about levels of service on that sort of thing, so that process works.
Yeah, great question. So it takes us into a whole series of interlocking policy areas, because I mean, clearly we've made some steps on fees, right? In terms of some increases, some additional fees on appeals and so on, some index linking, etc. And I'd asked officials to get me all the data over the last number of years by local authority in terms of how much of their planning fees cover the costs of the planning department. And I think across the 34 planning authorities over the last 5 years, like it was only 1 year in one authority where they actually got more than 100% of their fees came in from to cover the cost of the planning authority. And in many cases, it's well under half. And the average is about 60-odd%. So there's clearly still an issue in terms of fee levels to cover service. Now, that then takes in a number of, as I said, challenging areas, because if you're a developer and the conversation is, would you pay more fees to get a better service? Answer is yes, by and large. Although people still say that fees are perhaps too high in some instances. But it's local authorities that make those decisions on how they allocate their funds. And our agreement with local authorities is that as Scottish Government, we don't impose on them diktats on how they should use their funds in terms of ring fencing, and that's been quite a thorny issue that we've worked our way through over the last period to end up where we're at now. So we respect that, but we also, from my perspective, have quite a strong steer that they should absolutely be using those fees to help improve the service. Now, but when you're in that environment where the fees don't even cover the service as it is, improving that service, you're kind of not even at the starting line. So that's part of the challenge. So we're in that kind of difficult chicken and egg situation. Now that then leads you on to, well, what can you do to improve the resourcing? Because it's not just money; it's also, as you know, skill supply. So we've quite a bit on that. We've trebled the number of bursaries. We've got, in addition to that, we've got 18 graduate apprentices starting in government as planners, and we want to continue that and develop that. So that starts to add more capacity in the system. Part of the work of the hub, when it's up and running, will be to look to where we can access resource, even on a part-time specialist basis. It isn't taken away from planning authorities, because that'd be the worst thing to do. So it's additional resource into the system. So that's part of the drive as well. And I was at the British Irish Council end of last year, and So representatives from England, Wales, Northern Ireland, Irish Republic, ourselves, Isle of Man, Channel Islands, etc. And everybody's got the same issue on resource, on planet. So everybody's struggling with that. So I think we're taking steps there, and that's a road we need to go down. So I think the combination of all of that hopefully gets us into a better place, not as quick as we like, but it's important. Alongside that, you've got the work of Craig McLaren and the Improvement Service on championing and process improvement work, which is really important. They've done the peer-to-peer reviews between different planning authorities, a lot of ideas and actions coming out of that as to how planning authorities can get themselves up to the level of the best in terms of best practice. And then, of course, there's going to be all kinds of opportunities for digitisation, automation, etc., streamline processes. So there's a lot of bits to this that we continue to focus on. And there's one easy answer. But
I would have thought the one easy answer is just communication. I think that's one of your points. Is it's
Okay.
that ability just even to have that chat with the kind of planning officer, and that's just been slightly harder probably.
and is that a resourcing issue, or they're too busy doing other things, or is it a culture issue, or is it a misinterpretation of what their job is issue, or what is it? Yeah, yeah.
There's definitely a members would report a change since lockdown that a lot of people are working from home, and that is not conducive to the type of conversations between the different bits of planning authorities to get a quick answer. You have to speak to colleagues and things like that. So things are just not getting ironed out and they're taking weeks, when really it's a 5-minute conversation between two bits of a council to say, yes, you can, or no, you can't.
Well, and I think that's true, and certainly in councils, and it happens in government as well, even though you're in the same organisation, the bits of it don't always necessarily talk to each other all the time about everything they should be talking to each other about. I think what would be helpful is if you've got line of sight on what good looks like or what best practice looks like, and feed that in who's doing it well. That might be helpful to enable us to kind of flag that.
That's a good idea. I would say, just even if they were to say, I've got your email, it'll be a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
You know, even like when we speak to our staff, it's like acknowledge it and then say, I can't get back to you this week, but it'll be next week. It's when it just disappears.
Yeah, and I mean, be honest, I think when you're under pressure in terms of delivering things,
Yeah.
it's, that makes that problem worse. Of course it does, yeah.
Got an invitation from the Minister to put forward those examples of good practice. I'm sure people would like to take that. Maria, I think you've got a question.
Thanks, Karen. Maria Franke, I'm a director of Maria Franke Planning, and I'm also past chair of the Scottish Property Federation. My question relates to NPF4 in its entirety. And we heard from both Neil and Elaine some of the policies that have been causing niggles in the industry, and it's encouraging to hear that the Scottish Government is trying to work through these and find resolution to help the industry deliver development. But last year we went through a consultation process looking at potential reviews to NPF4, whether that be a complete overhaul in its entirety or particular policies, picking off them one by one. Can the Minister actually advise as to whether we are moving forward with any particular policy in particular that the Scottish Government is looking at in terms of scrutiny for review, or is there still the possibility of a complete overhaul of NPF4?
Yeah, I think there wouldn't be a complete overhaul anytime soon. I think it was quite interesting. We had an event on this recently, and the question was asked quite a provocative way about, do you think it's working? And we put their hand up, said no. They said, well, do you want us to go and rewrite the whole thing? And nobody put their hand up, right? I think the pain that would cause, if you're talking about NPF 5, then exactly. So I think the work to be done is to take what we've got, which I think is a good piece of work, and work through where we've got challenges on policies in terms of interpretation, implementation, where we guidance forward. Does that mean that at some point there wouldn't be a look at some policies? That may happen at some point. But a wholesale rewrite is not on the cards. I don't think anybody would welcome that, to be honest, because it would just build more delay and uncertainty into everything else anyway, on top of what's already there. So I think that work's done. This is about delivery and making sure that what we've got is working. As I said at the outset, we're in a world where things like biodiversity and climate change and you name it weren't an issue, right? Previously, flooding getting worse because of climate challenge, etc. So a lot of that stuff that's an issue now is not things you can ignore.
I like to think that going forward, it'll be much better because if you remember, we have national policies, which should mean we don't have local development policies, that we have all different ones. We've got a national policy on this so that everybody knows it and understands it. And it was meant to streamline local development planning so that they can be more, you know, kind of place-based. So we're just in that kind of little bit of getting used to it in the middle, but it's going to be beautiful down the line.
Couldn't have put it better myself.
Well, Elaine's a very positive person, and on that note, thought it might be nice to finish with a positive question. So, Victoria from the Brody's team, I think you've got a question for the Minister. If you can shout, perhaps from up the back.
So, I guess from a personal perspective, what do you consider to be the biggest success in planning in the past year or so?
Yeah, great question. I mean, there's a number of things that we've worked on. I think that the resource issue and what we've done there in terms of bringing more young people, significantly more into the profession, I think is probably the biggest thing, I think, because that's what lays the groundwork for the future. I think that, and we talked about it at length, the work we're doing to unpick what's actually happening in the housing land supply is important. Because that gives everybody visibility on what's going on. I suppose those are probably the two biggest things I would look back and say, yeah, that's been a bit of progress there.
Great. Well, I think it just remains for me to draw matters to a conclusion at this point in the afternoon, and to extend our thanks from Brody's and all the attendees we have in the room and those who've joined us online. To you, Minister, thank you very much for your time this evening. That's been really illuminating, I think, for everybody. And from what you've told us, I think a lot for us to be looking forward coming down the track and in terms of work coming out from Scottish Government. So thank you, everyone.